Welcome to AI Driven, a podcast about using AI for business. AI Driven is produced and hosted by Cognistx, an AI company based in Pittsburgh with offices in the US, Latin America, and Asia. Welcome to AI Driven. I'm Patty Maldonado. Joining us today is Cognistx data scientist Justin Waltrip. Justin, we've invited Justin to talk about the latest trends and AI headlines, and there's a lot to talk about. Welcome, Justin.
Thanks for having me, Patty.
In our last podcast, you talked about an attorney who used ChatGPT, citing cases he found using that technology. And his efforts made a lot of headlines, not only here in the U.S., but around the world. Tell us a little bit about the case and what happened to this attorney.
Yeah, so this is one of the first big news stories that kind of talks about some of the dangers of using AI, and it kind of popped that little bubble that people had that AI can solve everything, and clearly not in every case. So this was actually a personal injury lawsuit. So a man named Roberto Mata was represented by his lawyer, Stephen Schwartz, and they were suing Avianca Airlines for personal injury. And so the airlines itself filed a motion to dismiss the case. And in response, the lawyer Schwartz filed a response that contained 6 other cases to show precedent. So his goal was to say to the court, you shouldn't dismiss this case because here are 6 other cases where it was similar enough to what we're trying to sue for, and we think that there is a legal precedent for this particular matter. And the court looked at his response, and they were looking at these cases, and there were actually even quotes from these cases that kind of described what the case was about. But when they looked them up on their own kind of legal search systems, they couldn't find any of these cases. And so they essentially went back to Schwartz and they asked for more clarification. And in response, Schwartz sends them even more cases, and they all say, like, here are all the cases that show that this is actually a real thing. And when the court looked at these as well, they couldn't find these either. And eventually they brought in the lawyer Schwartz and had him testify directly, and he revealed essentially that he had been using ChatGPT to actually generate these cases. And so he thought that ChatGPT was a search engine. He thought that it worked pretty much exactly like Google. He had read about all of the incredible things that technologies like ChatGPT can do, and he thought that what he was looking up was the actual cases. He thought it was the same as looking in like a legal database. It was just like a little bit easier. And so he even asked things like, are you sure that this is a real court case? And the problem is that ChatGPT responded by saying, of course, yes, this is a legal case, and here are actually even more of these cases. And so this actually ended up with the judge threatening to sanction Schwartz. And that's a really big issue. And actually, in a separate district in Texas, a federal judge, a separate federal judge, issued a standing order at the same time that says that anytime someone uses ChatGPT, that language has to be very specifically flagged in any filings. So this was a really big topic.
So how has it impacted not only attorneys, but how other people use ChatGPT? Have you seen any kind of repercussions?
Well, I think the biggest thing is people understanding a little bit more about these issues with ChatGPT. And so a lot of people call them hallucinations. And it's when ChatGPT responds with something that isn't necessarily truthful. And I think when OpenAI first released the tool, they basically just provide like a search bar. It looks pretty similar to the way that you would type into Google search. And so I think a lot of people started using the tool and they assumed that it was just a cooler version of Google search, where you type in a question, you get a response, and your default assumption is that response is going to be truthful, that anything that the system is telling me is coming from something online. Like there's an actual website that gives you this information, but it's just kind of summarized it. And I think what this case shows is that that's not the assumption that people should be coming in with. This type of system doesn't have any concept of truth, and the text that it generates is very different than what Google search gives back.
So how do they know? I think one of the things is, how do you fact check the responses you receive when you use either ChatGPT or Bard or Bing or any of the other similar platforms that are available now that run on the what's called generative AI?
So I think it's important to first understand what generative AI is and kind of how it's different from Google search. And so when you train a system like ChatGPT, essentially what you're doing is you're feeding it tons and tons of text from Wikipedia, from Reddit comments, and the system is learning how to generate text that mimics those types of responses. And so when it's generating a response, if you ask it a question, it's going word by word and say it's already generated the president of the United States is, and now it's trying to generate that last word. It's going to look to all of the data that it has seen, and it's going to recognize that Biden shows up very, very frequently in recent history, and that's what it's going to return as the answer that it's actually giving to the user. And the reason that's somewhat problematic in terms of fact-checking these systems is that a lot of times they do get the answer right. And the only reason that they get those answers correct and that there's some actual truth in its responses is because that truth is represented really well by the data that it was trained on. So going back to our president example, there's a lot of pieces of text out there that says the current president of the United States is Biden. There's not as many pieces of text out there saying that the president of the United States is like a pizza or some other ridiculous concept. Obviously, to us, we know that that's immediately false. But to the system, if all of a sudden, instead, you trained this system on a bunch of data where you replaced the word Joe Biden with pizza, that's what it would be responding to your question with instead. It's really all based on the training data that it's provided. And this creates real problems when people try to go in and fact check these systems, because as a research community, we haven't really solved that problem yet. The best way that we know how to generate human-like text that actually is based on some kind of real information is to actually reference that real information directly. And so this kind of relates to one of the products we have at Cognistx called Square, where we actually use a combination of generative AI, which is what ChatGPT is, and extractive AI. And we've talked about that in the past, but it's where you're actually not generating text at all, but if you're trying to answer the question of who's the current president of the United States, it might actually point you to the Wikipedia article that tells you that Joe Biden is the president of the United States instead of generating that itself. And so it's not necessarily based on all of the training data that it's seen, but it's based on the actual sources that you are asking questions over.
That's a huge, a huge difference, and it's really interesting that you point that out. It's not necessarily it's based more on the sources, and that seems to be a more reliable method. So how should people be using ChatGPT and, other similar products?
So the important thing to note is that I'm pointing out a lot of the issues with ChatGPT because I think they're really important to talk about, and I think a lot of people don't recognize their flaws. But what OpenAI has built is really remarkable. ChatGPT and GPT-4, which is its successor, are really incredible. They're the best generative AI systems out there. And what these systems are really, really good at is generating creative text or things where maybe there's multiple correct answers. So let's say you ask ChatGPT to create a poem about puppies. Something like that, there's not one right answer. There could be many very good human-sounding poems written about puppies. And in situations like that, these systems are incredible. They do a really, really good job, and they're actually really useful for people like writers, where maybe they're trying to write their own poem, and as inspiration, they might want to use a system like this to kind of bounce ideas back off of. So it's really helpful for someone to just be able to kind of talk out what they're thinking about. And a system like this isn't necessarily going to produce entirely new ideas, but when you kind of prompt it in the right way and you use the right language, and some people are really good at this, you can get some really impressive results.
So you bring up, some really interesting tips and about how to use ChatGPT, how best to use it. I was wondering, and it was something that you also said regarding a judge in Texas, where the judge said, if you're going to use it, you need to say it, that you're using it. Should people be, should they have some kind of language that says, this information was provided or found by ChatGPT, or maybe they say something that says, ChatGPT or generative AI was not used in developing this report, so forth. Do you see more people doing something like that?
So this technology has only really been out for 7 or 8 months. And so it's kind of like the Wild West right now, because there's very little regulation or even best practices for how to use this technology properly. I think very recently the European Union has been talking about something called the AI Act, and it would actually regulate the use of systems like ChatGPT in really high-risk settings. And so a legal industry would be a really good example of a high-risk industry, because if you say something that is fake, or you write something that isn't following legal practices, that can be a really big problem. Another good example would be the medical industry. You can't just have ChatGPT generate a diagnosis. It takes doctors years and years to learn how to properly diagnose a patient with a certain disease, and they have to look at all kinds of different factors. And if they diagnose someone with the wrong disease, that can be really, really harmful. And so when you're dealing with systems like this, I do think it's really important to flag any text that was necessarily generated directly by ChatGPT. I think that's important for transparency, and so that people understand where you're getting this information from, especially if you aren't going to go in and fact check, like using a tool like Google Search, the responses that you're getting from ChatGPT. I think it's only fair that the people who are consuming the content that you're putting out understand that you haven't taken that additional step of verifying the information that you are putting out into the world.
So where do you see ChatGPT going and this technology? We've got ChatGPT came out with its first version. Now there's ChatGPT-4. Where do you see this going? Obviously, given how it's been used and some of the problems people have encountered, I'm sure there will be improvements. What do you foresee happening even in the next 6 months for that matter?
That's a really good question, because the rate of AI innovation has been so fast, even in the last 6 months, that it's kind of hard to predict what things are going to be like in 6 months, or even a couple years would be almost impossible to predict. But I do see a lot of the ChatGPTs being used in ways that kind of augment what people are already doing. And so there's been a lot of talk in the news about ChatGPT and systems like that going in and kind of replacing people's jobs. And honestly, I don't see a lot of that happening in the next couple years, because I think these tools are really best used to make people's jobs more efficient. So like I was talking about with the writer, or like a book writer, sometimes people get kind of stuck into a rut and they can't really come up with any new ideas, or maybe they're not quite sure how to write the next chapter, what the plot should be. And so for people like that, using a system like ChatGPT to kind of bounce ideas back off of, or maybe do some kind of summarization, or maybe just write something in a little bit of a different style, these systems are really good at that. And I think it's very easy for people who are creative-minded to take the outputs of a ChatGPT-like system and kind of customize it to what they need. So maybe they'll look at it and they won't just copy and paste the response, but they'll say like, ooh, that idea is really good. Let me work with that and kind of expand on that. And they're really just making the things that they do every day more efficient, and they're avoiding kind of ruts in the work that they're doing.
Yeah, but I can see that that might raise its own issues about authenticity. And I have no doubt that soon we'll have a book that's been written solely by using ChatGPT. If it hasn't been done already, it will come out soon, no doubt. But then it does, as I mentioned, it does raise the question about authenticity. Because if you're an author and you're leaning on a technology like ChatGPT to help you, what does that say about you as an author? I guess that's an issue people will have to deal with in the future, or in the very near future.
Yeah, I mean, that is an excellent point. And it is a real cause of controversy around these kinds of technologies. And actually, to your point, I do think there is a book that has been entirely written by ChatGPT and then entirely illustrated by image generation technologies. And that the person who used these technologies to kind of put it all together is trying to publish it under their own name, and they're kind of having issues with that because no one really knows how to deal with a book that wasn't actually written or illustrated by a human being. Yep.
That's the next hurdle, or one of the next hurdles.
But I do have one other point on this, which is I think we do have to kind of reframe the way that we think about content generation now that these technologies exist. And I think one thing that a lot of people have kind of pointed to is that when calculators were first invented, there was essentially like an uprising in education where everyone was saying, oh, how are students ever going to learn how to do math now that these calculators exist? Like, what are we supposed to be teaching them if they can just use these tools to get the answers directly? And I think over time, as a society, we've recognized that, yeah, calculators do give you the answers immediately, but they can't solve everything. They can't solve complicated word problems, and they're really just tools that we as individuals can use to kind of make the existing calculations we do every day more effective and more efficient and more accurate. And I think tools like ChatGPT are kind of, in a way, a calculator, but for human language. Mm-hmm. And so when people are using these tools, if you just type in a prompt to ChatGPT, like, write me a whole book about whatever topic, the results you're going to get are probably not going to be very good. They're going to be really generic, and no one's going to want to read that. When these tools really become useful is when you are able to use your existing domain expertise, like say you're a writer, and you're able to kind of prompt it really well. So you could say, I'm writing a book where this character is interacting with this character, and here are their personalities, and here's the setting that they're in, and I want to generate some dialogue that they may have had in this specific scenario. Obviously, something like that, a prompt like that, is going to generate much, much more realistic results, and they're going to be something that people might actually want to read. And it's not trivial to come up with those prompts on your own. So I think that's where this technology is ultimately heading, but we have a lot of work as society to understand exactly how we want to actually deal with these problems and what kind of regulations we need to put in place.
Yeah, and it's an interesting point. I've used ChatGPT and things like it to generate text, and I look at the text, I'm like, I can't use this. I take it and then I edit it because it's really, as you mentioned, really generic. It lacks color and, tone. And I think, that it goes back to the fact that obviously the information is as good as what's fed into the system, but it can only do so much. And I think, the human element adds a layer that a machine can't, or at least not yet.
Yeah, I entirely agree. And I think when we go back to the way that these systems are trained, when you ask it to write a story about puppies, for example, what it's doing is it's just looking at all of the training data it's seen about stories that might be related to puppies, and it's kind of just synthesizing them all together into something that kind of sounds like a human would have written it. And when you think about it that way, it's not really generating any novel concept. It's not going to write something that is entirely different from something that's already been put out there or published. And so that's the reason why when you just ask for kind of a generic story idea from these systems, the results that they're giving you are really just kind of the average of everything that's out there, and the average isn't really that exciting. And so that's why it's important to actually prompt these systems correctly and know how to use them to actually generate those kind of spectacular results.
Well, Justin, this has been a really fascinating conversation, and I wanted to invite our listeners, if they're interested in learning more about AI technology, you can go to our website, which is Cognistx.com. That's Cognistx.com. And you can also email Justin directly at justin@Cognistx.com. Okay, so we're going to be back with more headlines and discussions about the latest in AI news and trends with Justin and other members of the Cognistx staff in hopes of really educating the public about this technology, which is really, truly fantastic and wonderful, but, needs to be addressed in a particular way and to be understood in order to use it correctly. So, Justin, any parting thoughts?
I don't think so. Thanks, Betty.
All right. Well, thanks a lot, and we'll be back with another show in a couple weeks. Take care, everyone.
Thanks for listening in. Learn more about how AI drives what we do at Cognistx.com.